Hello, THEO 1004. This week in our virtual classroom, we're launching into the study of Paul in our Interpreting the New Testament module. Since we're under quarantine and we're doing all of our classes by YouTube and Moodle, and since I happen to be quarantined with someone who did their PhD on Paul, I figured what better way to introduce you folks to the academic study of Paul than through this interview format. So we have with us Dr. Matthew Anderson, who sometimes teaches at the University of Nottingham in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, but is currently our honorary research associate, and other times teaches at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, in their Department of Theological Studies. So Matthew's PhD was in Paul, in religious studies, specifically focused on Paul. And so I just asked him, without really showing him our slides, I just asked him if he would sit with me and have a conversation about that I'm going to call Paul the basics. So I asked him if you knew you only had like a 15-minute video to kind of tell people the basics of the academic study of Paul, which things would you want to mention, Matthew?
All right. First thing I think I would say in that kind of a situation is that I would say Paul is incredibly important for lots of reasons. Most people there are billions of Christians in the world today. And a lot of times when they look at their scriptures for Christians, it is Paul that they're looking at. It's the writings of Paul. And the reason for that is that in the New Testament, the Christian Testament, 14 out of 27 books have Paul's name attached to them in some way. 13 have his name attached. The 14th is Hebrews, and we can talk about that later. But 14 and even 15, if you include Acts, which has a lot of Paul in it, have a lot to do with Paul. And so the New Testament is about Jesus, but in fact it's interesting how much of the New Testament is actually comes out of Paul or is in some way attached to Paul's name. So that's one thing. The other thing is that for people who don't know much about the New Testament, for intro kinds of students, one of the things I would say is that one of the reasons that Paul is important is that Paul is in fact the oldest complete. Paul's letters represent the oldest complete texts in the New Testament. A lot of people think that because the Gospels come first and then Paul's letters come later, that means the Gospels were written and then the book of Acts and then Paul, because that's the order they're in the New Testament. That's not it at all. Paul's letters were written 40, 50 years, 75 years before other parts of the New Testament were written. And so Paul's letters represent the oldest entire conserved writings in the New Testament. So they're interesting and valuable for that point. What else?
I would go even more basic if I were you. If I were introducing someone like an alien,
right.
If you're introducing an alien to Paul, I would say there are many world religions, and one of them is called Christianity, and it follows this person named Jesus. But in its sacred text that's about Jesus, many of the books in there were written by this one guy from the 1st century who was Jewish.
Yeah.
So, yes, a Jewish 1st century follower of this Jesus person who was really passionate about his view of who Jesus was, and so he wrote a lot about it because he was lucky enough to be trained in rhetoric and writing.
Right. So at a time when 98% of the world was illiterate, 98% of the Mediterranean basin world was illiterate, Paul comes along, and Paul, was not, he wasn't necessarily the very top 2% or 1% of society, but he was trained. He could read, he could write, and he was rhetorically trained in some way. And so he represents an important view onto the 1st century. So he was Jewish, as you said. Thank you. And he was the other thing is that Paul is incredibly important because he accidentally changed the world. And the reason we say he accidentally changed the world is that because he became the spokesperson for Jesus in some ways, but he had actually never met Jesus in the flesh. So he had had a vision of Jesus. Now for Paul, he would not say, oh yes, so if you're Peter and I'm Paul, he would not have said, Peter, you walked around with Jesus. If Jesus stopped quickly, you bumped into his back. If Jesus snored at night, Peter knew what it sounded like to hear Jesus snore at night. That's true. Peter was with Jesus in his teachings. Paul was not. Paul had only ever met the resurrected Jesus, so it had a vision of the resurrected Jesus. Now for Paul, that didn't make him second rate, because what was important for Paul was the resurrected Christ. That is, Jesus after Easter, after the visions that the disciples had of Jesus coming back from the dead, being raised from the dead. So Paul is unusual. He is the primary spokesperson for the Jesus movement. He never met Jesus in the flesh and didn't walk around with him. He's accidentally a world changer because Paul never thought that there would be a world to change.
Why not?
And the reason is that Paul was an eschatological or an apocalyptic. I'm using the words as if they mean the same thing. Technically, they're not quite the same. But he was an eschatological prophet, which meant that Paul felt, and he didn't invent this out of the air, Paul felt probably based on teachings of Jesus, who said something like this. Paul felt that he lived in the very last generation of human beings who were going to live before the kingdom of God, of Israel's God, would come in and change society forever and be the paradise, the basileia, the kingdom that would go on forever.
We have already talked about that because
Okay.
in our class, we've gone through the Gospels first and we talked about historical Jesus questions.
Yeah.
And so we talked about the context of Second Temple Judaism or early Judaism
Right.
that came along before Christianity, and how not a majority, but a pretty important minority of Jews were apocalyptic in their thinking, in that they believed an apocalypse is like the end of the world, and they believed that time was linear, and they were living in the last era, and the end was going to come. What they disagreed on was how it was going to look. Was it going to be a battle against Rome that they won and then established a nice Jewish kingdom, in Jerusalem?
Yeah.
Was it going to be that God was going to send chariots down with warrior angels and destroy all the earthly powers and then set up some kind of eternal spiritual kingdom? We have so many apocalyptic texts before Jesus and Paul came along, but what my students have already learned is that Jesus was definitely an apocalyptic thinker.
Right.
He was telling people there was an urgency, like, hurry up, the kingdom is at hand, the kingdom is already beginning.
Right. And that business that you've already talked about, where the kingdom is already beginning, Paul is a part of that. A lot of Christians in the 21st century and for most of history have sort of thought, even academics in the last couple of centuries have thought Paul kind of came up with ideas all on his own. Well, yes and no. I mean, Paul was exactly like what you just described about Jesus. He felt he was an eschatological thinker who felt the end of the ages was upon him. In that sense, he was typical of a certain stream of first century, late Second Temple Judaism. Like Jesus was, and he was very much in concert with Jesus. Paul has been accused sometimes of changing the message of Jesus entirely. At least when it comes to the eschatological thinking, yes and no, he didn't. I mean, Paul was also saying the basileia is coming. Now, he was tying it to Jesus' resurrection in a way that seems unique and new, but isn't when you start to think about the idea that you've probably already talked about in class, which is this idea of a belief in the resurrection, an expectation of the resurrection. And that brings it back to something I'm sure you've already talked about, but just to say again, which is that Jesus's resurrection, even though for most believers since, has been treated as a one-off. In other words, Jesus was raised, and then humanity, if Christians will believe, if people believe in Jesus or trust him or whatever it might be, they will go to heaven or something. Well, in the first century, no, it was Jesus was resurrected as the first moment in a general resurrection that was coming. It was like...
Yes, I've already told them
you
that.
Talked about that.
I've told them that the resurrection, from what we can tell from a lot of early Jewish texts, was a time.
Right.
The resurrection was the end.
Yeah.
And so if they heard tell someone has been resurrected, they're looking for everyone else who's died to be resurrected. They're looking for the end of the world.
It's like the credits in a movie.
Yeah.
Jesus is the first credits
if
to roll.
Jesus resurrected,
on the movie.
then that would tell eschatological Jews the credits are about to roll. This is it. And they're looking around for something, a battle.
Yeah, something, whatever it would be.
Definitely overthrowing the Romans.
Yeah, and Paul was part of that. Paul was the same way. So to come back to Paul. So why
that wasn't the basics. It was a total nerd tangent.
It was, but that's okay.
We got to bring it to the basics.
So to bring it back to Paul is important because, you know, half of the New Testament, of the Christian Testament, is either about him or has his name attached to it in some way.
Okay, what's in there? Like, what's in the New Testament by or about Paul?
Okay.
Or claiming to be by Paul.
Okay, so there are a bunch of books, half, like I said, 14, 15 with Acts out of 27. So probably the oldest complete Christian document, or Jesus believing document that we have. I can't say Christian because it's Jewish, it's the first century. And these were a group of Jews who followed Jesus. The oldest document like that is 1 Thessalonians, we think. Now, none of these documents have any dates, so it's a guesswork a bit about it. But 1 Thessalonians is likely the oldest one that we have, and then comes along the other books. So you have maybe you have Galatians next. There's no order that we know for sure. So 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, you've got. Then you've got Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, and then maybe you may have Philippians in there, or 2 Corinthians, and then you've got, so what have I said here so far? 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, if I didn't already say that, 2 Corinthians, if I didn't already say that, Philemon, and Romans. And so you have 7 letters which we absolutely know were written by Paul out of those 13. So 7 letters that...
And those are the earliest books that made it into them.
Yeah,
they're
those
the
are
oldest
the earliest
books in the New Testament.
Those are the oldest documents written by Christ followers that we have.
Well, there may be others, but not that made it into the New Testament.
Yeah, well, that made it into the New Testament.
The Didache maybe, some people say, first century.
Right.
Some people say parts of the Gospel of Thomas are first century.
Yes.
But out of what made it into the canon, these are the oldest books.
These are the oldest
there.
ones.
These
that's
7
right.
letters of Paul.
And and the point I just want to say again is that they're considerably older than the Gospels. They're a generation at least before the Gospels. And why do they come before the Gospels? Because they're working documents. They're like the emails of one particular part of the Jesus movement.
Yeah, they're letters.
Yeah, they're letters, and they are of a particularly unusual part of the Jesus movement, which was the part of the Jesus movement that had to do with non-Jews. Mm-hmm. Which, again, one of these weird twists of fate is that in those brief years before the apocalypse was about to happen, before God would return, the God of Israel would return with Jesus as Messiah for the Jesus followers. In that brief period of time, it was all about the Jews. Everything was about the Jews. But in fact, Paul's unique mission that he took on himself was to go to non-Jews, to the people he called Gentiles.
Apostle to the Gentiles.
Apostle to the Gentiles, yeah. I just wanted to say about that Paul was important also because he left us these documents. I mean, you talked about that, so... Now this is supposed to be about the basics of Paul. So should I go into some? Okay.
We're talking about first year students, freshers. Some of them have not read the New Testament before this year. So what do they have to know? So we've covered Paul is a really influential part of Christianity. Yeah. Lots of his books, which are letters, real letters, written in an early time of the Jesus movement, before it even really turned into the Christian religion, was the first century. It was still a part of Judaism. So he wrote a bunch of letters and really influenced the movement. wrote them largely to non-Jewish people, which was a bit different from the rest of the Jesus followers.
Yep.
What else do we have? There are 7 of them that are the oldest books in the New Testament, and everyone agrees that these 7 were really written by Paul. They're the authentic epistles, the undisputed epistles. What else have we covered? He's an apocalyptic Jew, in line with one type of Judaism that had been around for a few hundred years before him, eschatological Second Temple Judaism. What else have we got here?
Well,
he was interested in this movement around this guy named Jesus, but he never met Jesus. In fact, he only joined the movement after Jesus was executed by the Roman state. But according to one part of the New Testament, while Jesus was walking around teaching in the Galilee, gathering a movement with disciples and doing healings, exorcisms, miracles, at that point, according to the book of Acts, Paul hated that movement and actually actively wanted to destroy it and was like, these guys are wrong, I got to get rid of them.
Yeah, after the resurrection, or after the crucifixion. Yeah, he was.
And then he has this experience, as you mentioned, the vision of the resurrected Jesus, and then joins up with or without the approval of everyone else who's like, what, are you kidding us? We knew Jesus. You think you know him better than we do? What are you doing? He's like, no, I had the vision. I'm an apostle. I'm on an equal playing field with you guys. I changed my mind. I joined. And boom, he's off promoting it passionately after they must have been left going what? First he didn't care. Then he hated us. And now he joins.
He photobombs the movement.
He joins and he doesn't agree with us.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the letters themselves, you'd raised a couple things that maybe I should come back to. So, the letters. So what can you say about them? They're real letters. So later on, when Christians start writing theology, they deal with them like they're treatises or essays or something. They're in fact real letters. So if somebody wants, so they're real letters. They're written to real people. They're written with real urgency. And then some interesting things that most people don't know, and your students might not if this is their first contact with this, and a lot of other people don't either, to be honest. They were dictated. They weren't written by Paul. Paul did not write these letters, he dictated them. That was not unusual. It was very common for somebody to dictate a letter and for somebody to take it.
Actually, this is mentioned in their slides for this class, and we're getting into the section of the slides that talks about the difficulty in why it's difficult to get to the historical Paul. Why is it difficult? What are some of the challenges for historians who want to really understand Paul?
Right.
And one of them is that he didn't write an autobiography.
No.
He wrote letters. And when we write a letter today, there's a lot of missing information. If you just pick up someone's letter, you don't know you don't know anything about the other person. Is this a letter back to them? Have they written first? Are you answering questions that were asked in another letter that we don't have?
Yeah.
Are you writing it differently because of the recipients? I don't write the same letter to my grandmother as I do to my students, as I do to my best friends, as I do to my spouse. So that's one of the methodological problems for historians reconstructing Paul. The best evidence we have for him was written by him, but the genre is letter.
That's right.
And secondly, like you mentioned, they were dictated and meant to be performed.
That's right. Yeah, they were meant to be performed. Often the person who would write it, who was called the amanuensis in the ancient world, the secretary, might well have been, say it was Timothy, might well have been also the person carrying the letter and then performing it in a certain way. And it's like reading a stage play without seeing it. You don't quite know how it was going to be carried off on stage. It's very possible that Paul said, when you get to the point that says, do not eat meat sacrificed to idols, that he said, okay, now Timothy, I want you to look over to the right and look at these people, because those are the ones that this message is for. No, we didn't get that.
Right.
Because we just
don't
have
get the
words.
stage directions.
We don't get the stage directions.
There's a part of Romans where Paul says, I commend to you our sister Chloe.
Yeah.
And people think, aha, that's who was trained to perform that letter.
Yeah.
If he's commending her to them, she's the one bringing it, so she's been trained by Paul to perform it.
Yeah, to take the message.
But we just have the text.
That's
we don't
right.
have any of the kind of stage instructions.
Well, and to perform it means also to interpret it. I mean, so Chloe in this case adds content to this letter. I mean, you can't help it when you are giving words to something. You're adding to it maybe slightly. You're also emphasizing certain things. So Chloe is a part of that message in that case to the Romans.
It's like a monologue from Shakespeare.
Yeah.
10 different people can do the Hamlet to be or not to be monologue, and they're all very different interpretations because
Absolutely.
the person brings their.
So just to reiterate those basics then, Paul is important because half of the New Testament has some connection to his name. 7 undisputed letters that we know absolutely are from Paul.
Are the oldest books in the New Testament?
They're the oldest.
Earliest.
They're a couple generation or 2 or 3 before other surviving books in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Paul becomes the most important interpreter of Jesus, even though his only experience of Jesus is this vision afterwards. Paul's letters are unusual in that it's like tapping into an email exchange halfway through. We don't have the original letters that he sent, except in like the Romans or Philemon. In most cases, we're somewhere in between. So in 1 Corinthians, at one point he says, in my previous letter to you, and this is 1 Corinthians. So in other words, there is somewhere in the world there was a 0 Corinthians, but we don't have it. It never survived.
Or do some people think that the copy we have is 2 letters melded into one?
That's more the case. I mean, maybe with 1 Corinthians, but it's more the case with 2 Corinthians, which is considered to be an amalgam.
Yeah.
But in any case, Paul wrote other letters that did not survive. That's the point.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what we have, and Philippians, so on, a lot of these letters are halfway through an email, in our terms, an email exchange or a text.
It's like it's actually exchange. The 9th email in the thread, and but it's the only one we have.
Yeah, so right. So he dictates his letters. They're meant to be performed. We get the ones that we have are partway through a long exchange, and we just get a slice of it.
We don't have them all.
We don't have them all.
And the manuscripts we have are not first century. They're hundreds of years later, so they may have been edited down.
Right. There may be some edits to the thing as well.
Yeah.
And also, just like we do when we write, as you said, when we write letters to different people or emails to different people, I spend a lot more time on an email to a potential employer, say, than I do on an email to a close friend of mine with whom we're hanging out all the time.
Yeah.
And so you have to understand that context as well.
In the slides, I told the students this. We talk about this as occasional. The letters are occasional. They're suited to one occasion.
Yeah.
And so it's tricky when they end up in a Bible that's someone's sacred text, and then the church has to take that occasion and just read it as though it's about us now.
Yeah, that's right.
And that can get tricky.
It can, and it does, and it has in many cases.
Yeah.
So I think those are the
basics.
But
now we've said a number of times Paul wrote half the New Testament or is connected with half the New Testament, but we've only mentioned 7 letters, so the math doesn't add up.
Right.
27 books, 7 undisputed epistles. What are the rest?
So what happens is that very quickly, because is that we have letters which are called the Pastoral Epistles, which are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, which are claimed to have been written by Paul, and 2 other letters, Colossians and Ephesians. So there are 5 other letters in addition to those 7, which have written in them.
6 other letters.
There's also
2 Thessalonians.
And there's 2 Thessalonians. I'm sorry, that's right. Thank you so much.
2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians are called
6.
The pseudo-Paulines.
That's right. So
or the disputed Paulines.
Right.
Yeah, and then 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus
are the
pastoral epistles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so tell me about those 2 categories, pseudo-Paulines and pastoral epistles.
Right. Well, in terms of, again, I mean, this is just a category of academics. Every academic, no matter how critically they are looking at the origin of these letters, almost all, sort of 95% or whatever, believe that those 7 letters represent Paul's work, the 7 that we talked about before.
Yeah.
Then we come to what are called the Deuteropaulines, and they're called that because the belief of academics, who are just academics, so we're arguing with each other about this all the time,
Yeah.
all of us. They're just not as sure about Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. And there are lots of good reasons, and if this is a basics lecture, maybe we don't go into it too much, but it has to do with the kinds of things, if somebody writes a letter saying it's from Alexander the Great and it mentions cars,
Exactly.
it's not by Alexander the Great.
Yes.
And
yeah.
we know the concept of fake news quite well. Or internet memes, which are not really by the person. That thing about Abraham Lincoln saying, "Don't believe everything on the internet." Well, there you are.
Yeah.
So anyway, Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians, there are just some hints of things that have made some scholars sit back and go, "Well, I don't know."
Yeah.
So they are called potentially pseudonymous letters, and that is a word which simply means perhaps written in the name of somebody else. And we know that happened, and part of the reason that we know that happens is that even in the New Testament itself, in 2 Thessalonians, it says, don't believe everything. Don't be alarmed by a letter which purports to be from me but isn't. So in other words, if somebody is warning about this, then it does happen.
Yeah.
If you're warning about forgeries, then there are forgeries.
Yeah. Actually, the class, the textbook kind of takes a stance on this and is quite negative. I usually love Bart Ehrman's introduction to the New Testament, but I do disagree with this bit in the textbook where he talks about pseudepigraphy, or the act of writing under someone else's name. He really calls that forgery and looks at it as a kind of trickery, and that's one aspect of writing under someone else's name. But if you look at Second Temple Judaism, it was quite commonly done, and very few people were thinking, if they were reading a book called Enoch, that it was really written by Enoch.
Yeah.
They knew it was written by someone who considers Enoch a hero and wants to be falling under the same tradition, like wants to align themselves with the hero of old, Enoch. And so some people think it's a disaster that some letters claim to be by Paul but aren't. It's kind of a lie in the New Testament. But other people see it as like, no, it was decades were passing by and some community members were like, I am with that hero of old, Paul. I'm following in his tradition. But when we look at the letters, the reason why they're disputed is that we can see some things in them that are like, that kind of disagrees with Paul's earlier stuff. So either he changed his mind, maybe drastically, maybe like a complete, like he's saying the opposite now, or maybe this was written a bit later.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I could say it any better. That's it. I mean, the one thing I don't think Ehrman talks about this either is that another thing to keep in mind when thinking about pseudonymity that most scholars don't talk about is that this is also a period of time when these assemblies were characterized by prophecy and the prophetic spirit, and people would stand up and in the spirit of the God of Israel give a prophecy, and to do that also in the spirit maybe of a departed. I mean, it's not that they're it's in the tradition of it. They're not channeling. I don't mean that, but they're in the tradition
more like
of
honoring.
Yeah, what Paul would say would be something like this, and maybe that's also a part of where that comes from. So you've got those three: Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians. And Colossians and Ephesians are very, very similar to the point where people think one cribbed from the other, borrowed from the other. And
or they're two divergent versions of something
of
that was going around.
Yeah. And so there's some debate about that. Is there Pauline material there that was simply moving around in a circular way?
Yeah.
And
we can tell by their concerns that they're a little bit later. Because if you lay out all the early Christian Jesus movement documents chronologically, you can see certain interests popping up around the turn into the 2nd century, and some of these pseudo-Pauline or pastoral epistles, definitely, if you didn't know anything about them and you had to place them, you'd place them early 2nd century.
Yeah. things like false teaching.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and Paul's main concerns seem to be, where did the non-Jews fit into the Jesus movement? So
where did the non-Jews fit into
letters,
the history of Israel?
Yeah, that's right. Where do the nations fit into the history of Israel, and how does Jesus as Messiah fit into that picture?
Yeah.
And the resurrection has happened, and for Jesus, according to Paul, and is now going to very immediately going to happen. So Paul didn't expect another generation. Paul was not preparing for the future, because the only future was the future in God's hands. There was no future for the world empires, for a Christian church, anything like that. If Paul were to show up in a time machine, be flabbergasted at the idea that there are 1 billion plus people who call themselves Christians who read these texts, because he believed
as part of their Bible,
because there would have been no Christian Bible, because there was no time for any of this in Paul's mind. None of this.
In fact, I told my students the reason why we have Gospels later is because people were only then, at the end of the second half and the end of the first century, some people around Jesus were dying.
Yeah.
And people were starting to go, but wait, if they've died, like he was supposed to come back before any of us died, what if this isn't the end? And then they start thinking about posterity. And then, really late, like decades later, they started thinking, maybe we should set down what Jesus said and did, and like our stories of his life, because maybe this community needs to last a long time. It's not just an urgent kind of...
Yeah, as long as you have eyewitnesses, you don't need to. When my father was in his last couple of years, that's when I started writing down his stories about when he was a child. Because just like everybody else, you think, all these people will go on forever, and then you realize all of a sudden they don't, and that's when you start writing. You'll lose
the stories.
You're going to lose the stories, and that's where it comes from. So that's the basics.
There's lots more. Started to veer into the topic that's at the second half of my set of slides that we're going to do a second video on, which is the new perspective on Paul, and the radical new perspective on Paul, which focuses in on how his relationship to non-Jews has really changed the world and affected Christianity, and how Christians and scholars' interpretation of that may have been drastically wrong for most of history, and how now there's quite a radical shift in the way scholars view Paul's thoughts on the non-Jews. But that's going to be the second video.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do we got? We have 7 undisputed epistles. We have some pseudonymous epistles, 6 of them. We have
all of the mechanics of the letters.
Yes, Paul's written or connected with a lot of the New Testament. We have, he's a first century Jew, but he never met Jesus, but he came into the movement late, but he really hit the ground running.
Yeah.
Was really mission oriented, was on a mission. He was a visionary. Yeah. Had an experience that just turned his whole life around.
Yeah, not a conversion, because he was a Jew before and a Jew after. It's not a conversion.
Yeah, people call Paul's conversion, but Christianity was really something that split off from Judaism
Much later than him, yeah.
In the first century, there were many different kinds of Jews, and Jesus' followers were one of them. So conversion is the wrong word for what happened to Paul. So you were calling it his vision.
Well, and also his calling. He uses language that's very much like Jeremiah or one of the prophets.
Like a prophet receiving a call.
He even says, when I was in the womb. So he's using prophetic language.
Much better, yeah. His visionary experience, his life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's stop there for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.